Welcome, everybody, to the American Space Museum. I'm Mark Marquette. So glad you joined us this Monday, May 19th, 2025, with a monthly guest that we always look forward to having on here, Mr. Nick Thomas. Hello, Nick.
Good to see you again, Mark. Thank
Great
you.
to see you, sir. Of course, Nick has been the lead communicator now. He's been at Kennedy Space Center 38 years. He's been helping us 2 years do our program here, we being me and Marty Winkle, a true national treasure, working for the on the lunar module and the shuttle. And Nick, how are you?
I'm doing fine, doing real good.
How things going out to Space Center here?
We're in our quiet time, which is good. We've earned the rest, and we've earned the breather before summer kicks in. But we've been doing fine. We've been having a good turnout at the autograph ops and the chat withs and so forth. But it's a relatively quiet time that every operation in Florida is going through right now. We have the added advantage, however, that we can always boost our attendance whenever we have a launch.
Yes,
and that
indeed.
that doesn't do Disney any good. It does us a lot of good. So we're coming through nicely. We're having a good time, and just getting ready for the hot weather that's coming our way. It's already here, but soon we'll be looking at the humidity, and then down the line there are hurricanes and other kind of interesting weather phenomena here in Florida.
Never a dull moment.
Never a dull moment.
Yeah, I was out there at the Space Center and saw you last week and remarked that, like, wow, got a room to move around here.
Mm-hmm.
And still you said there was almost 3,000 people come through there. And, when you hit 5,000, then you know it. But an amazing place. Delaware North, of course, manages it, just keeps adding new layers to it on there, it's a must bucket list for everybody, of course. And one thing you've got to do is see the astronaut talks at 11 o'clock, and then 3:15, an astronaut of the day gives a wonderful audiovisual presentation, and then you can get an autograph and a photo with that. And there's nowhere else on Earth where you can do that,
no
right?
place else. You can come to our establishment 7 days a week, 365 days a year, or when we're open, and there's going to be an astronaut there that you can meet, that you can speak to, you can have your picture taken with, and nobody else does that.
No,
we're the only ones that do that.
That's with your ticket, and then you can add a layer on that and have a one-on-one with a couple dozen people in the astronaut.
Doing a chat
right?
with,
Local people here are watching. Who's going to be out there the next few weeks that we'd like to see?
Well, one of the fellows that we've got coming back who hasn't been with us for a while is Dan Tani. Dan's going to be coming back, and Dan has the distinction as far as our operation is concerned, is that Dan was the first ISS crewman that we ever had on board with us. And he was able to bring people into the world of the long-duration ISS flight, explain that to them, and that was a real page turner for us, because up until that time, we'd had astronauts who'd flown on 10 and 12 day long shuttle missions, which is great. But everybody was wondering what that International Space Station is like, because it's up there now, it's warm, it's working, we have people up there constantly, and we wanted to hear from someone who had the experience of what it was like to live on board the International Space Station, and that's what Dan gives us.
Dan Tani, can't wait to meet him. Never have out there. Marty's got his books and all of the autograph hounds out there ready to go get their stuff autographed.
I think the term is pounce, if I'm not mistaken. They're all ready to pounce out there.
I usually thank the astronauts for doing this. It is such an outreach. I remember saying to John Harrington, we took him to dinner, and I said, John, you're going to be the only astronaut that, like, probably half of these people ever meet their entire life, going back to Nebraska or Ohio or whatever. Sure. And that kind of got to him.
Yeah.
He didn't think, he goes, what? I've never really thought of it that way. Well, and I'm going, well, think about it.
You understand, he lives the life where everybody around him meets astronauts every day. And so forth and so on. Living that life. It's kind of like anything else. You're reaching out of your bubble or your own experiential base and meeting people who have not been as tightly involved with it as you have and have been seeing it from a whole different perspective. And that can sometimes be an eye-opener and a very pleasant one. And there's a little bit of surprise there. But the gratification comes from the fact that you as an astronaut are able to come back here and make that personal connection with that person from East Lampshade, New Hampshire, who watched, these missions on TV, but always wondered what it was like from the absolute perfect source, which was the astronauts themselves. And so it's very gratifying for the astronauts from that aspect. And like I say, they all feel very strongly about the ability to come back, to make that connection, and to give back in a way to, God bless them, the taxpayers who sent them up there. One of the guys, people will say to him, thank you for flying in space. And he'll say, thank you for paying your taxes and sending me up there. So that's pretty good.
Well, so it's an awesome group of people. Yeah. 633 humans have orbited this beautiful Earth. And we're going to talk about 3 of the great ones and 3 of the early ones here. That's why I'm wearing my heroes on my chest here. Up there, we've got a great program on the 3 Mercury flights in the month of May. 3 out of 6 were in May, and Nick is going to share some history and some personal experiences about that. But let me first just line up the week here, Marty. We got. Thank you, Marty. Hit the button there for me. Got to have Nick today. Terry White's going to talk tomorrow. He's going to talk about the chin of the space shuttle.
Yeah.
All right, a little area of the important area of the shuttle too, called the chin. And then we're going to have Mayor Andrew Connors on. Connors with a C on the end. Gabriel Rothblatt, our executive director of our nonprofit foundation, the U.S. Space Walk of Fame, and myself, the director of the museum, have gotten to know the new mayor, and he's very tuned into Spaceview Park. As how could you not be talking to me, because it's just a national monument out there. This is like the Big Ben or Taj Mahal, or the only place in the world you can put your handprints on these 3 Mercury astronauts we're going to talk about. And Andrew's going to talk a few minutes, 25 minutes. We got to be out for a board meeting that I've got him coming in front of. So we've got a great week lined up here, and we always love Nick coming on with his history. But like we just did, I love talking about the status quo of things are going on. And one of these days we'll have a little healthy debate of who's going to the moon first, Americans or Chinese.
There's no debate. We've already been to the moon first, so it's a dead issue.
Second, that's right. I phrased that wrong. But Nick's a great friend of our museum now, and also our master of ceremonies at Shuttle Fest. And we're talking a lot about the next one coming up here in April 25th, 2026. So, Nick, I'll give you the floor there, forwards and backwards there, my friend. Take it away.
Alan Bartlett Shepard, America's first man in space on May 5th, 1961. Graduate of the United States Naval Academy, naval aviator, test pilot, and husband of Louise. A remarkable man, complex, as they say, but absolutely the perfect choice for the first American to fly in space. And a remarkable story that he told to Roy Neal before Admiral Shepard passed away. Roy Neal asked him, what was the most iconic moment of your career? Was it flying in Freedom 7? Was it walking on the moon? He said no. He said the biggest moment of his entire life was when he and the 6 other astronauts were called into Bob Gilhu's office up at Langley one evening. And Dr. Gilhu told him, we've been watching you guys now and evaluating you and so forth, and we made our decisions. Alan Shepard is going to fly the first flight. And Shepard said that moment, above all else in his life, stood at the apex, at the pyramid, top of the pyramid of what he experienced.
Could see why.
Yeah,
America's first man in space. Actually, that was before Yuri Gagarin flew. Was he told before Gagarin flew?
Yeah. Gagarin flew about 3 weeks before.
So no human being had left the bonds of Earth's gravity.
Absolutely. So Shepard was looking very much forward to being the first human being in space until Gagarin and the Russians screwed that up 3 weeks before.
We've got a question already. I know Nick's got a pretty good program lined up, and he'll be glad to answer any questions. By the way, he doesn't have any notes in front of him, so I admire that. What's the question, Marty?
Dean Babcock is asking, When was Launch Complex 14 decommissioned?
Complex 14 for the Atlas program and John Glenn. I think the last launch from Complex 14 was an Atlas Agena. I don't know if that was in support of a Gemini mission or if that was a deep space probe, like or one of the probes that landed on the moon. But that would have put the decommissioning of Complex 14 sometime around 1967 or 1968.
And this is that complex, right?
Yeah,
Our
this
green
is
screen
14.
here. That's what we got.
What a beautiful pad and what a beautiful picture this
Yeah,
is.
that's a
This is
beautiful.
Gordon Cooper's vehicle standing on the launch pad. But you see the
Now, how do you know that?
I know because of the date on the photographs.
Oh, okay. Okay.
The service tower on the right, and then the mobile tower, which at pad 14 would roll back to that position and then roll off to the side further down the track that you see over my shoulder there. And that was a parking space for it further away. Plus, on pad 14, we had somewhat of a triangular support tower, where at pad 13, which was also Mercury, which was also the Atlas rocket, it was a squared off service tower that only moved back. It didn't move back and away. But those were some of the differences. And I've had the privilege of spending a lot of time out on pad 14, of course, well after the Mercury program. But you just can't go out there and not be engulfed by the history and the great meaning of that location and what happened there. And in fact, on the 50th anniversary of John Glenn's launch on Friendship 7, I went out to the pad that morning and I had my timer set, and exactly at T0 in the launch for Friendship 7, I was standing by there by the remnants of the pad and just contemplating what was taking place there that day in 1962 that just made us all
February
so proud.
20th.
Yeah.
So you were out there. Wow, that's a cool memory to have there. I just want to know why you knew that, because sometimes there are telltale signs in the photograph that's a little trace. I love looking at
most of the
pictures
sources that I get these photographs from are well documented, and they include the date that the photograph was taken.
Good. Well, let's get on here with our suborbital
Admiral
astronaut,
Shepard,
who did,
right.
of course, later do other things.
Yeah, Admiral Shepard. Here he is with the first three: John Glenn, Gus Grissom, and Alan Shepard. And at this time, NASA was only telling the public that it was going to be one of these three. However, everybody knew, including the three, that Al Shepard was going to be first. And you might see a little extra twinkle in Al's eye in this picture because he knows he's first among equals. But at one point, there was, Tom Wolfe tells the story, that when these three guys were put up as being the first three, that somebody in NASA said, well, let's call them the gold team and we'll call the other guys the silver team. And it was like, no, we're not going to do that. No way.
Yeah.
So, yeah, they all took their part in support of this launch. Grissom followed Shepard very closely because it was known that Grissom was going to fly the second suborbital flight. John was Al's backup for this mission, so he was very close as far as supporting the preparation of the capsule and so forth. So all three of them worked together and brought about this great flight that took place on May 5th, 1961. And let's see what we have next. Well, we talk about hobbies and avocations and loves, and here's Al with one of his true loves, which was his Corvette. Al took a lot of pride in being the only of the group who would regularly drive his Corvette from Langley, Virginia, down here to Florida. And I suspect he didn't always pay a lot of attention to the speed limits when he made that trip. But Shepard and Cooper were probably the most competitive as far as racing was concerned. They both had Corvettes that they'd gotten from Jim Rathman over in Melbourne. And they would regularly engage in these Corvette races on the back roads of the Cape and over on ICBM Road and so forth. And for every one of these races, Cooper would always win. And what was worse, he would win by a longer and longer margin each time. So Shepard kept taking his Corvette back to Jim Rathman saying, look, I can't win these races. You got to look at it. You got to fix this thing. You got to get it running right. He'd say, all right, we'll do our best, and give him the car back, and he'd race Cooper again, and Cooper again would beat him. So it wasn't until Al's funeral, and this is on YouTube. You can see this on YouTube on Al Shepard's funeral. Cooper did one of the eulogies for Al, and he confessed at that time. He said, "Al," he said, "I'm sorry I played all those tricks on you. And I'm sorry that I had Jim Rathman reduce your gear ratio every time you went to take your Corvette in to be fixed." So Rathman was in on it, and like any good con, you never let the guy know that he was stung. But Cooper kept that secret all the way until Al's funeral.
That's a good one.
And I wouldn't want to have been Gordon Cooper going up to heaven and having to face Al Shepard after that.
Waiting for him, like gear ratio.
Yeah, but these guys were just they were competitive and cooperative all at the same time, and I think that's one of the things that endeared them to the public, because they could kind of revel in the competition and the tricks played on one another, but they all knew that when the time came, the mission came first for everybody, and everyone pulled together. And I think that was one of the things that captured the imagination of the American public as he saw these stories in Life magazine over the Mercury program.
And a good book that I have enjoyed rereading is Wally Schirra's Space.
Yeah.
It's filled with a bunch of those gotchas and stuff in there.
Now there were guys who would take a gotcha with good grace, but there were guys who didn't like being got, and Al Shepard was one of them.
That's why they got him more.
And to a degree, Wally also didn't like being gotten over on. But you know, that's just people. That's just
right.
folks.
Payback is heck.
This is one of my favorite pictures of Alan Shepard. This was during a press conference that was being held, and I'm trying to remember. Shorty Powers was there moderating it, and Grissom was not in attendance. But they're all asked to stand up. Let's get a picture of you, and they wanted to get what was basically a Mount Rushmore picture of all these guys together in profile. And Al just decided to break character and snap that smile at Ralph Morris, and that was a picture he ended up with. And I think the reaction of John Glenn is priceless, because John's face says, "Okay, it's just Al. This is Al's thing. It's okay." Wally's back there, sorry that he didn't do it first. But,
right.
And Gordo is slightly bemused. And Slayton, I think, it's like, all right, what the hell is that? So,
Nick, you did a wonderful program on the photographer Ralph Morris one time of Life of magazine, and
he took the pictures that I grew up with, and he was able to infuse these pictures with soul, with personality, and he was just hands down the best photographer of the space program, and just the right guy you needed at the time to bring these qualities out in his photojournalism, to not only inform the public, but to entertain the public, and there was nothing wrong with that. A picture like this isn't so much informative as it is entertaining, but it's always good to know that these steely-eyed test pilots have a sense of humor.
It's photojournalism.
Yeah,
it's,
exactly.
To him to push the trigger and everything be right.
Being able to capture that moment.
That's a classic there. Let's see, we got Mark Thel saying hi. We got greetings from Western Colorado. Got to give you a call, Mitch, up there. Mitch Rothman. He was just
we
recently...
just had dinner with Mitch.
Mitch Rothman?
Yeah.
Right. And he went to the Huntsville on his way back up there. So Tammy says hi. Tamara Miller. Hello, Mark,
Hello,
Marty, and Nick. Thank
Tammy.
you for watching, Tammy.
Yep.
And that's Sundog says, from one man in Earth orbit to landing men on the moon less than 10 years is mind-boggling. And that's why we love our American Space Museum and everything about it there, Sundog. So let's continue here with more of this wonderful 3 Mercury astronauts in the month of May.
Here we are on launch day, May 5th, and Shepard and Glenn having breakfast together over at Hangar S. Just before this picture was taken, there had been a lot of discussion about the White Room technicians with the names of their companies on the back, McDonald, for instance. And somebody made that remark that we didn't have anybody with a NASA white suit up there. But Glenn, before this picture was taken, he showed the white suit he was going to be wearing out at the pad, and it was written in marker. It said NASA across it. So I guess he was kind of proud of that.
I'm looking at this big picture here. It says human.
Yeah, some part of some chart up there. I haven't found out what that is. But what you see here is a classic breakfast of steak and eggs and orange juice for the astronauts. And again, this was something that we grew up with all through Gemini and through Apollo. And I don't think you saw real changes in that tradition until the shuttle program, where the guys realized, well, steak's not my thing, and I'd rather have something else. But before that time, for the first 3 programs, steak and eggs was the astronauts' breakfast.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, pretty much good fuel that stayed in your body. Didn't have to eliminate much of that. So that was part of it, too.
This is in the White Room out at Pad 5 as Shepard is approaching his spacecraft, Freedom 7. You can see that this spacecraft does not have the trapezoidal window of later flights. It has the 2 portholes, one at your left shoulder and one at your right side below the hatch. So this is all you had to look out through the window. It didn't make a lot of difference since it was only a 15-minute flight. The other thing you had as far as viewing was concerned was the periscope. Now, when you're on the pad waiting for the countdown, the periscope remained deployed until about 3 or 4 minutes before the flight, and then it was retracted. Well, of course, the sun is coming up over the ocean, and that sunlight comes directly into the periscope. So you had a series of filters inside the capsule that you could snap onto the periscope screen so you wouldn't have this sun glare beating you in the eyes. So Shepard had this gray filter on there, and as the periscope retracted and before the countdown reached 0, Shepard realized, well, I need to take that filter off so I can get a good view of the Earth. And he moved to take the filter off, and his hand grazed the abort handle. And he said, no way, I ain't touching nothing. I am not fouling up. And that filter stays, the filter stays. So when you hear Shepard up on orbit saying, from the periscope, what a beautiful view, he's looking at a gray Earth through that periscope filter.
Really?
Yeah.
Huh.
But like he said, I realized I had to say something. And I had to say something that was going to please the American public, so that's what I said.
Huh.
Inside the capsule, and here you get a fairly good idea as to the tight quarters of the capsule. He's hooked into the aircraft or the spacecraft oxygen supplies, so his faceplate is closed as it would be throughout the flight. And he's strapped in very, very tightly. And of course, as kids, our imagination was caught by the concept of weightlessness and the idea that you could float around and be absolutely free. What we didn't realize was you were strapped so tightly into that spacecraft, there was no way to really feel that weightlessness except maybe by your arms letting them float up. But at the same time, that control panel was so close you didn't want to accidentally hit a switch. But experiencing weightlessness in Mercury was nowhere near like it is on the International Space Station.
Go ahead, Marty, with a question.
Robert Law is asking, is it true originally there was to be no window, but astronauts complained to get one?
Yeah. They complained about they wanted a window through which they could see the horizon, because that was going to be critical in controlling the attitude of the spacecraft. That came in especially handy for Gordon Cooper and for Scott Carpenter, as we'll talk about later on. But that trapezoidal window was very, very important. They also insisted upon a hatch that they could open themselves, and aircraft, high-performance jet aircraft, had explosive hatches and ejection seats for a long, long time, so that was not at all an unusual or unreasonable request. But that window was very, very critical, especially as we'll see later on in the program, the photographs that were taken by Glenn and Carpenter and Cooper. So yeah, that window was at the insistence of the crew. They just didn't have the time to retrofit the window into Al Shepard's capsule, but Gus Grissom's was the first one to have it. And an important point about Gus Grissom's flight, everybody says, well, it was just a redo of the Shepard flight. Well, more importantly, Gus's flight was the first test of the orbital version of the Mercury capsule. It was equipped not only with a trapezoidal window and the explosive hatch, but also the control panel that an astronaut would need to control elements of the flight during an orbital mission. So Gus Grissom's flight was actually the first manned test flight of the orbital version of the Mercury capsule.
Good question there. We also got William Whiting. Says hi to
Hey,
you.
Bill.
Great to see you, and thanks for putting today's presentation together, Nick. We appreciate you sharing your knowledge with us.
Thank you. The liftoff from Pad 5, just a beautiful, beautiful picture when you consider what's happening here. First American being launched on top of a rocket into space. And for me, to have the privilege to be able to go out to that launch pad anytime I want, stand out there and just soak in the history. Now, Pad 5 is, of course, deserted, and it's a very, very quiet place out there. So there's nothing better than to go out there anytime during the day, although early mornings are best, to go out there and just revel in the absolute silence out there and just concentrate on all the history that happened at that launch pad. It's always inspirational. It's always something that I enjoy. It's something I always get so much out of. So these pads, these old pads, although they're disused and not being used anymore, is still very inspirational, and they still carry the power of what I was feeling as a young boy when this was going on. When this was going on, I was 50 miles up the road at my home and on Halifax Drive, watching it on television, and we ran out into the backyard and we looked over the trees, and of course we couldn't see the rocket because the Mercury had burned a very clean combination of fuels. But we saw it when it went through the condensation layer, when you see that white contrail, when you hit the condensation layer. And that's when you could see it. You could look up at that condensation layer and realize that at the tip of that is one man inside of a spacecraft. So that's where I got hooked on that day on May 5th, 1961.
Just talking about this pad and reminiscing like that, I'm thinking about General Medeiros behind the blockhouse there, Kurt Debus, and Ike Ridgel, who is an important person here at our museum.
Luton,
just learning their chops, learning how to do this. Nobody knew how to do this.
On those first Redstone launches, there was a German engineer in the blockhouse. When the engine fired up, he would watch the color of the exhaust. And when the color was just right, he knew the fuel-air mixture was okay, and he gave the go ahead and blow the bolts and go. That's how it was done back in those days.
That's right.
Yeah. Al Shepard on board Freedom 7 during that 15-minute suborbital flight. Now, I am aware that there are a number of celebrities who recently flew a suborbital flight with Blue Origin. Yeah, Blue Origin. And one of those celebrities compared that experience to Alan Shepard, saying we flew the same profile that Alan Shepard flew. Well, I will tell that young lady that, first of all, Alan Shepard flew 115 miles up and 300 miles down range. As soon as his capsule detached from the Redstone and turned around, he took the controls and manually controlled the roll, yaw, and pitch of that vehicle. And I would ask that celebrity, what controls did you have in that capsule, and what did you do as far as that was concerned? Don't get me started kind of thing. But here's Shepard, and actually this picture was taken just after the main parachute deployed. He's about to unhook that hose on his left side, which inflates the seal around the inside of his faceplate. He unhooks that hose, and then he raises his faceplate, and he spends the rest of the descent watching the altimeter unwind until splashdown. But yeah, this is essentially the flight is concluded. He's under the parachute, and I think somebody did a get and said that Al spent more time under the parachute than in any other phase of the flight. 15 minutes on the whole thing from start to finish. But here he is coming down. Job well done. Still not taking anything for granted, but realizing fully what he's just accomplished for the country. What has to be an immense feeling of satisfaction for a job well done and a great flight. Here he is being taken out of the capsule, being winched up onto the helicopter. Shepard was winched up. Gus Grissom was also winched up under some pretty bad circumstances. But after this, every Mercury astronaut stayed inside the spacecraft for recovery. They did not open the hatch until they until they got on the aircraft carrier, or in John Glenn's case, on board the
Well,
destroyer
there'd be
Noah.
one exception to
There's
that.
one exception to that. That's Scott Carpenter. We're going to talk about those circumstances in a little bit.
Always
But
get,
this
always
is-
get. You have a dangerous flight to space, and then you got to go through. I'm not going to say this is necessarily dangerous, but things could go wrong here on hoisting
Sure,
you
absolutely,
up, and
yeah,
the
but-
aircraft, and
But
everything
remember,
like that.
they've done this before.
Yeah,
They've done
there's
this
so
in
many
training,
layers
and
of danger that they just.
Oh, you don't take anything for granted.
Yeah.
You don't say good flight until your feet are on the aircraft carrier deck. And the guys in mission control did not light up those post-flight cigars until the astronauts stepped out onto the deck of the recovery ship.
Absolutely.
Yeah, but-
Layered with things all the time. on there.
Absolutely. And as a pilot, as a test pilot, you understand that anything can go wrong at any time. You don't turn your back on the situation, and you never take anything for granted.
Apollo astronauts come back from the moon. The first thing they do in that capsule in the ocean is probably grab a barf bag.
Oh gosh,
You know,
well, it's
It's
just
just
the terrible stories you hear about that. It was just not something to look forward to, and I'm wondering about how well these Dragon astronauts do. I mean, they're recovered fairly quickly,
yeah.
but at the same time, that capsule cannot be a very good.
Oh,
boat.
I've seen that marshmallow just a bobbing
Yeah.
around there. Oh my God!
And
He's
it's like, cut the rope and let's go home. Get me on the ship, So that can't be any fun.
Alan Shepard, certainly honored correctly, not just around our space coast here, but a U.S. postage stamp was done to honor his flight. His daughter, Laura Shepard Churchley, is well. She loves her dad.
And she
Everybody knows that.
She got the chance to fly suborbitally
Yeah.
too. I thought that was wonderful,
Yeah.
and I congratulated her on it when I met her, and we talked about her father, and I told her a story of we were at a reunion of journalists who covered the Mercury program, and all the journalists were there, Howard Benedict and George McGuire and all those guys, and two astronauts who attended were Alan Shepard and Gordon Cooper. Well, after the speeches and the festivities, we all repaired to the bar, and we're sitting around the bar, and Shepard's talking about the Freedom 7 flight, and he's still angry about the fact that he was beaten by Yuri Gagarin. God damn it, we could have had those guys. We could have been first, and it was true because of the extra tests they'd ordered for the Redstone rocket because of the failure on MR1. But he's still steaming about that, and one of the reporters says to him, Al, if you had been the first man in space, you probably would have never walked on the moon. And Shepard thought about it, and he says, yeah, you're probably right. And when I told that story to Laura, she said, yeah, that was Dad.
That's a good one.
Yeah.
Yeah, she's an awesome lady.
And this is on the recovery aircraft. They're leaving Grand Bahama Island. They've been there for about 2 days, and now they're coming back. They're going to land at the skid strip over on Cape Canaveral, and then he will make his way from there to Washington, D.C., and his reception at the White House.
Laura Churchley, Shepard Churchley, told me this quick story about her dad that you would appreciate. When he did come back from Apollo 14 and they were quarantined, the first thing he did when he got out of quarantine was go see his barber. I think his barber's name's Oscar.
Uh-huh.
All right. She said Dad was a little bit vain. He liked looking sharp.
Probably
He,
got his hair cut once a week.
And that he didn't want to go out in public after being the moonwalker, looking shaggy. He went to, and there's a story where he may have given this barber one of the golf balls that was on the moon.
I hadn't heard
There's
that.
a little. I'll send you that little documentary on that. But yeah, he's of course admiral in the Navy, and one of the. It's true that he's the first astronaut millionaire. Parlayed his money into some real estate and so
God
forth.
bless him. He started making deals as soon as he got back from Freedom 7. And back in those days, the rules weren't as restrictive as they are today. But Al Shepard came from what I would call Northeastern aristocracy. His parents were very prominent, and he grew up in a very, I'll say, a privileged situation. He had all the ability to talk to people and, take part in, some of the high-end social gatherings, let's say. But he was very astute. He could talk to people. He was very shrewd. and he ended up making some very good deals. And I think it was Walt Cunningham. He talked about Al when Al was chief of the astronaut office when Walt was an astronaut. And he said basically Al ran the astronaut office as one element of his far-flung empire. And Al owned a couple of banks. He later on had a Coors distributorship. He had several businesses. He was on many boards, and very, very active in that regard. And I say God bless him for every penny he made.
There you go. He earned it for doggone sure.
Sure.
Well, another astronaut, Mercury, flown in the month of May is
Scott Carpenter, the pilot of Aurora 7, the second orbital flight, followed directly John Glenn's three-orbit flight on Friendship 7, and a very circuitous route because the flight, the second flight after Glenn's originally belonged to Deke Slayton. Deke was already training. He named his capsule Delta 7. And he was in training for that flight when he was suddenly pulled because of his heart irregularity. Now, Wally Schirra was Deke's backup, and normally it would have been Wally's flight. But NASA decided that since Scott had spent so much time training with John Glenn, and this was going to be another three-orbit flight, that Scott would be a better choice. And Wally fumed at that. Wally was not very happy at all, but I think it was Chris Kraft who said, look, just hold your mud, just take it easy. We've got something big plan for you, which eventually they did. So Scott was given the flight. Now, since the success of Friendship 7, there were some people, particularly in the scientific community, who felt that the spacecraft had already proven itself. 3 orbits, no problem. Let's start doing some science. Now, that would not have gotten a good reception from Deke Slayton. Deke was all about flight tests and taking care of the vehicle. But Scott was a different kind of a fella, and he not only welcomed the scientific involvement, he encouraged it. And they just poured on experiment after experiment until you got to the point on the flight plan ratio where it was 20% flight test and 80% science. An admirable goal, but simply too early in the program for that to happen. But Scott took on all that science with a happy heart and went on to perform that science with some somewhat questionable results, but we'll talk about that shortly. Let's see what we have next. Now, Scott was, God bless Scott, he was a different critter. Whereas most of the guys after work, it was time for beer call at the O Club. Scott might very well go home and plop down some cushions with his wife, Reen, and play his guitar and talk philosophy. And yes, Yellowbird was his favorite song. I made a point of having that on my tape player when I picked him up from the hotel on the first morning of our assignment together, and he got a kick out of that. But he was quite simply different. While all the other guys were playing handball, Scott was a fencer, and he'd show up at the astronaut gym, and he would uncase these 2 foils or épées, and he was like Captain Blood out there, fencing with his partner. But Scott was just different. He was both a gentleman and a gentleman. He was, bar none, one of the nicest people I've ever met that I've been privileged to spend time with and work with. Scott reminds me of a description that was once given of President Kennedy, but I think it fits Scott much better. He was restlessly attentive to the next question. His favorite phrase, and I heard him say it time and time again, was, "Isn't that interesting?" And his mind could absorb anything and take it to its next natural conclusion. His mind was restless, as I say. And he would have made a great scientist on board the International Space Station. The only problem is you'd have to hit him in the head with a mallet to get him to go to sleep because he simply would not want to stop. But his curiosity simply knew no bounds. And it didn't matter what the subject was. Scott wanted to know it and know it as thoroughly as he possibly could. Now here we see during a training exercise. Now this was standard training for all the astronauts, although Scotty was the only one to use it. There was a way to leave the capsule through the nose. And what you had to do was you had to remove one side of the control panel and put it aside, and then snake your way up around out of that couch and then up through the neck of the capsule and remove a pressure bulge, a hatch, and then make your way through that opening there. Now, luckily, Scott was very, very slender guy, and he was able to fit through that opening comfortably enough. Now, this was especially useful in Scott's circumstance when he landed, because he was out in the middle of the ocean all by himself, no recovery forces. He wanted to get out of the capsule because it was so damn hot inside, but even with the landing bag deployed and the capsule fairly stable, you didn't want to take a chance of blowing that side hatch. So what Scott did was he wriggled around and got his way up through the neck of the spacecraft. Now, as you came up out of the neck of the spacecraft, the higher you got, the more the center of mass would change and the capsule would gently tip over into the ocean. And that way, you've already got your raft inflated outside. So as it laid down, you just pull yourself out of the capsule into the raft. The capsule will then bob up back to the vertical, and everything was fine. But not an uncomplicated procedure to get around there and get wriggled around through that tight capsule and get out of that top hatch. But he was able to do it.
Training for every circumstance,
Oh, yeah.
and that
Sure.
was so important there. And you and I saw the checkout list on that. It's just one thing that keep your the boat and your raft and your supplies, survivor bag ahead of you. Don't drag it behind you. I kept saying, put it in front of you. Get it out first.
Because as soon as you got your head up
what
there.
a rare photo that is you harvested there.
And there is also another picture out there of John Glenn doing this in a wave tank that they had out at Langley. And you can see John is coming out of the neck of the capsule into the raft, and the wave machine is providing waves, so you can understand what it's going to be like on the ocean when you do that. So this was not a unique procedure to Scott Carpenter. All the guys trained in this procedure. Suiting up over at the up on the second deck of Hangar S, Joe Schmidt, I expect, getting the suit checked out. And then from there it was leaving Hangar S and getting into that big, what the guys call the cattle car, to make the trip out to Launch Pad 14, which was about a 20-minute drive, as I recall.
Somebody asked us, Marty, in an earlier program, as we're talking with Nick Thomas here, a fascinating program about the 3 Mercury flights in May. Why was the suit silver?
Silver at the time was thought to be most reflective as far as heat was concerned. If you got into an overheated situation inside the capsule, it was felt that radiant heat could be repelled by the color of the suit. Later on, we found out that pure white would do just as well, and so that's why you saw the white pressure suits, the G4C suit, on the Gemini program. Now, in fact, if you go to Gemini 3, you'll see in several of the training instances that John is wearing the white suit, but Gus is wearing a dull silver version of that same G4C, because they were still considering using that silver, but they realized afterwards that white was going to work just as well, if not better.
Now we know. Thank you.
Coming out of Hangar S, that big door at Hangar S, and heading to TV1, which was Transfer Van 1, what the guys call the cattle car, for that 20-minute drive out to the launch pad. I think you could see the silver medal on Scott's chest. They called that the hero medal, and it was a mirror, actually. And that mirror was used so that the automatic preset camera in the control panel, taking a picture of Scott, could also see through the mirror what lights were lit on the control panel and whether they were green or red. So you couldn't read labels from that image, but you could certainly see which telelights were lit and whether they were green or red if you were doing an investigation after a post-flight investigation. Again, the tight quarters of that Mercury spacecraft, not at all enough room to swing a cat.
Mirrors right there.
Got the mirror on his chest.
I'd love to see that with my own eyes. I've never seen that.
And
those had mirrors on their
the
cuffs of their
cuff mirrors. And John Glenn was the first to wear that mirror, and then I think Wally Schirra was the last. Gordon Cooper didn't have it, didn't use it. But again, you can see his suit is pressurized, his faceplate is closed. The hose toward the bottom of the image is the oxygen hose, and then the thinner hose up on the other side is the hose that seals that rubber flange around the inside of his faceplate for an airtight seal. And again, on his left wrist, you'd see the pressure gauge for the suit, so he can monitor that if that was at all any kind of a concern.
Let's go back. There we go. The launch.
And the launch. Everybody looks at the pictures of the launch of Aurora 7, and they'll notice that they're not quite as bright and clean as the other Mercury Atlas launches. And the reason there's a haze in that picture and other pictures of the launch is we had a forest fire here in Titusville at the time.
Oh.
And that smoke blew over to Complex 14, and that's why the images of MA7 are somewhat cloudy or somewhat hazy, because of the smoke blowing over from that
May
fire here in
21st?
Titusville. Yeah.
May 21st, yeah. 1963.
62.
62, yeah, sorry, 62. Well, I didn't know that. Wondered about that in there. Cool, beautiful.
One of the pictures that Scott took from Aurora 7, this, as I recall, was actually over Hawaii, which you can see is quite overcast. But if you look toward the left of the image from your view, you can see a fuzzy line there. And that is the scribe mark on the window. And you can see kind of a crossbar toward the bottom. Now, there were 3 crossbars on that scribe. And using those crossbars, you could align the capsule either for orbital flight, for retrofire, or for reentry. So that was the importance of that trapezoidal window. Again, you got a good view outside and a good way to align your spacecraft. Now, this also brings to mind the controversies of Aurora 7. Of course, Scott's capsule landed 250 miles beyond the recovery zone, and there's been many discussions over the years of Scott's attentiveness during this flight and whether he reported things about his capsule that he should have. Chris Kraft, I will recall in Chris's book, he was very unkind to Scott in his participation of this flight, and said that Scott did not apprise anyone of the condition of the capsule. But I will tell you, if you go back in the transcripts, and I talked to Scott about this, you look at 16 minutes and 19 seconds into the flight, Scott is giving what's called a short report on capsule status, oxygen, fuel, and things of that nature. And he also says during that transmission, what I'm seeing out the window does not match what I have on the instruments. And this was the first manifestation of that 25-degree yaw to the left error that was part of the automatic stabilization and control system, the autopilot, if you will, or the ASCS as we'll refer to it. Now, that was a problem because, of course, the ASCS was responsible for lining up the capsule for retrofire and for reentry. Scott made mention of this at 1619. No one on the ground picked up on it or said anything about it. But on the other hand, Scott should have come back 5 minutes later and said, hey, what about this odds that I have with the instruments and what I'm seeing out the window? What do you guys have on that? But he didn't do that. So throughout the flight, of course, Scott was quite preoccupied with the scientific experiments he was performing, making observations of the Earth and moving the attitude of the capsule this way and that way. And unfortunately, during this period where he was doing all this maneuvering with the capsule, he crossed his controls to the degree that he was using fuel out of the automatic and the manual fuel tanks. So he was hosing out a lot of propellant. And they tried to tell him several times, let's ease off on the maneuvers and stay in orbit attitude unless it's absolutely necessary. But he continued to do this. So when it came time for reentry, he was getting himself into retrofire attitude. And all of a sudden, something else caught his attention, and he turned the capsule to look at it. And Al Shepard, who was a Capcom in California, told him very clearly, Scott, you've got 25 seconds to retrofire. Get into retro attitude, which he did. Now, he used his instruments, and unfortunately, his instruments carried that 25-degree yaw error. So he's 25 degrees off in yaw. The automatic control system is supposed to fire the programmer is supposed to fire the retro rockets automatically. It doesn't. Scott has to then push the manual override button to get those retros to fire. He delayed in pushing that button about 2 or 3 seconds. So all these things together ended up causing that 250-mile overshoot that he had on the recovery area. On the other hand, after he got down on the water, of course, he was far away from any recovery forces. And he had a lot of time, well over an hour, nearly 2 hours, I think, in that raft before the recovery forces arrived. But he had time during that time in the raft to contemplate in complete solitude what he had just been through over the last 4.5 hours. To think about that flight and everything he saw and everything he experienced. 2 hours by yourself to think about that. That's something that no astronaut has had before or since that flight. And Scott was deeply affected by that. He was a reflective person to begin with, but the experience of being able to think about that all by himself in that raft was very important to him, something that he said he'd never forget. And I would say that in that regard, Scott Carpenter probably got more out of that flight than many astronauts who've flown multiple flights in any other program. Philosophically, that was just so very important to him. Other people, of course, would say, well, it wasn't the time for that. We should have been paying attention to the spacecraft and its performance. And of course, on the next flight, Wally Schirra's Sigma 7, we did. But for the fact that the flight was not a complete success, I think personally, for Scott Carpenter, it was very, very rewarding. And he came away, I think, with memories that the rest of us can only dream of having.
What an insight there, Nick. Really, think about that. 2 hours in the ocean. You think people are coming after you. You've just been orbiting the Earth and seen seeing this gorgeous thin blue line that all the astronauts talk about.
And to his last day, Scott was able to talk about that flight and any aspect of it as if it had just happened yesterday. It was that clear, it was that sharp, and it was that crystalline in his memory. And that's not something that everybody can say. You know, some people say, well, over time it drifts out of your mind, but it never left Scott's heart and it never left his soul. And I think he was very fortunate. Here he is in the recovery helicopter after having been picked up by the recovery forces. They had dropped a couple of frogmen in the water and they swam up to the raft and said Scott was in good shape. As a matter of fact, he offered them some of his rations. They said, no, it's safe. But some people were afraid that he was taking the whole thing rather cavalierly. And after recovery and after the debriefing, he realized some of the places in the flight where he could have done better. And he became very, I don't know how to put it, confessional perhaps, where he would say, well, I could have done better. There are things that I didn't do well. And some of the NASA people said, get a hold of this guy and tell him to stop talking like that. This flight was nothing but a straight up success, and that's how he should talk about it. But Scott, very honest person, and he never took umbrage at the fact that some people blamed him for the failure of that flight. It never bothered him. He knew who he was. He knew what he had done. And I remember one time he said, you know, yeah, I took the rap for that failure, but that's not very important in the sense of long-term scientific exploration. That's just the kind of guy he was.
Interesting. A great attitude. He was blackballed actually by Chris Kraft. Never flew again, but he did something very interesting after this.
And truth be told, to be frank, he probably shouldn't have flown again because he simply didn't have that mindset that you really needed at that time in the program. As I said, years later, he would have made a great mission specialist on a shuttle flight or a space station program. But when you're in the midst of a developmental flight test program, your head has got to be in the cockpit all the time.
Yes. But he had an interesting career after this.
Yeah, he went back to the Navy and he took part in Project Sea Lab. And in fact, he was at the bottom of the ocean when Gemini 5 was orbiting overhead. And he spoke by radio to his buddy Gordon Cooper on board Gemini 5. After that, he went into several businesses, one of which was wasp breeding. he bred wasps.
Wasps.
But that doesn't surprise me. The guy was curious about anything that would come across. That's interesting. I wonder what that's all about. Let's try it. But that was the kind of guy he was. But in his later years, of course, he wrote his memoirs. His daughter, Chris, helped him with that quite a bit. But he had simply found his place in life. He was living his life with a good deal of grace and good humor, and he was a remarkable guy, and as I say, one of the nicest people I've ever had the opportunity to meet, bar none.
Well, we've got one more astronaut. Oh, here you are meeting him, bar none, right there. There you are.
We're doing not chat with an astronaut. We're doing Dine with an Astronaut, and Scott would do these shows and talk briefly and then take questions. And so here we are in the office in between presentations, and like I said, just a wonderful guy with a very warm heart and a very full soul. You don't meet many people like this in your lifetime. If you're lucky, you might meet one. And I was fortunate enough to spend time and work with Scotty, and it was great. I'll never forget, because we stayed in touch even after we worked together. We stayed in touch. I'd done a couple of documentaries with Bruce Elric, the filmmaker, and we had sent one to Scotty, and he was very enthusiastic about it. He ended up showing it to a lot of his friends, and whenever we talk, how you doing? You still making documentaries? I said, oh, we're working on another one right now. But yeah, just a good guy.
Mitch Rothman, no, you met him, had a picture of Mitch in his Colorado home up there. A lot of great comments. People are enjoying the show. We got one more astronaut to talk about. Tom Colbert's up in England, so he's in
Ireland.
Scotland?
Ireland.
Oh, Ireland. Yeah, Tom Colbert's in Ireland. Very interesting show, great chat. Amy Collins says the joke was you didn't fly inside the spacecraft, you put it on.
Yes, that's true. That's what they said. The other thing they all said was you realize you're sitting on top of a vehicle that had built by the lowest bidder on a government contract.
Yeah, indeed. So thank you all for RG Jubilee says it looked like he climbed out of a caterpillar butterfly out of a cocoon in there.
Oh, Scott would have got a kick out of that.
that analogy, him then sitting there like a butterfly drying his wings, thinking about where am I going to fly the next time in
How
my
about
life
that?
here.
Yeah. Oh, Scott would have definitely liked that.
His book is called Spacious Skies.
Yeah.
Yeah.
For Spacious Skies.
I haven't read too many shuttle books of astronauts, but certainly I've read all the Mercury and Gemini books, and here's another good one there. Well, May 17th, I think, was this? No, May, 17th. No, launched the 15th and landed the 16th.
Leroy Gordon Cooper, the pilot of Faith 7, another guy who was definitely not in the strict mold of the fighter pilot, a guy who was not averse to taking a chance, and certainly not averse to speaking his mind. The story is that just before MA9, about 5 days before the launch, they made a change to his suit without telling him. And he did not like that, and he decided to go to Patrick and pick up a F-102 or whatever they were flying at the time and just kind of work some of this anger out. And he's flying over the Cape, and there's Hangar S. And he just decides he's just going to let everybody know he's there. And he came hauling ass down Hangar S and down on the deck. Walt Williams was up on the second deck of Hangar S, and he could look down and see Gordo's jet going by. And it took off, and he laid a big sonic boom on the whole base. And, oh, God. Walt Williams, who was program manager at the time, was totally pissed off about it. Now, at this time, Deke Slayton is the director of flight crew operations, and Alan Shepard was a backup pilot on this flight. So Walt picked up the phone, and he called Alan Shepard. He says, Shepard, is your suit ready? And he said, oh, my suit's always ready. He says, well, Gordo is out, and you're going to have this flight. Well, Deke heard about it, and Deke called Walt back. He said, look, that's not your call. That's my call. Give me a chance to get this guy straightened out. So they all get together that same night at the Holiday Inn, and it's Gordo and Deke and some of the other guys. Walt wasn't there. He was still too pissed off. So all the guys are briefed on what's going on, and Slayton kind of briefed them on what to say. So one of these guys says, "Hey, did you hear about that guy who flew the 102 right by Hangars? God, I heard Walt Williams is so pissed off about it. He's going to use that guy's guts for garters." And they're all going on about this. And Cooper's getting smaller and smaller and smaller in his chair. And Deke called Walt Williams back. He says, "I think we taught our boy a lesson. I don't think you're going to have any more trouble with him." And they didn't. But he was
Let the family take care of the family.
He was a free spirit, and no question about that. But as we'll see here, he went on to fly one of the best flights in the program. Here he is at home with the family cat. You don't often see a test pilot doing this, but kind of a view of the his more down home side, if you will.
Ralph Morris again.
Ralph Morris picture.
Showing the
Right.
people in their environment.
Yeah, and again, Ralph was so good at that. Ralph knew how to do that and do it so well. Gordo leaving Hangar S, and Wally Schirra behind him. Of course, Wally had just flown the previous flight. Now, Al Shepard being Gordo's backup, Al would have been up on the White Room getting the capsule into its final configuration, making sure that everything was all right. Now, of course, at this time, Al was lobbying for one more Mercury flight, MA-10. And MA-10 should stay up there in orbit for 3 days, and I ought to be the one to fly it. So he goes to Chris Kraft with this idea, and Kraft says no. He says, "Al, the Mercury program is finished, and we're going to move on to the Gemini program." And that week, Al was going to the White House along with the other astronauts, and he said, "Well, do you mind if I bring this up to the president?" And Kraft says, "No, go ahead and bring it up to him. Just let him know what my point of view is." It's okay. So they're at this party, and Al takes the president aside and tells him about his ideas for MA-10 and how we ought to do this 3 days and, maximum duration and so forth. And the president is listening and listening. And so finally Al finishes, and the president looks at Al. He says, "Well, what does Mr. Kraft think?" And of course, the president knows what Mr. Kraft thinks. And Al says, "Well, Mr. Kraft thinks we shouldn't do it." And the president thinks about it, and he says, "Well, I think we'll go with Mr. Kraft's recommendation." And that was the end of MA-10.
Could a Mercury have survived 3 days in space?
Well, the idea was, Al was talking about, let's just run the flight until things start to fail. And that ended up what happened
With
here on
Gordo,
MA-9.
yeah,
So
right.
we'll talk about that directly. Here's Gordo getting into the capsule out there at pad 14. You can see the window is covered by that red safety cover. He's got the handhold up there, squeezing into the capsule, getting ready to spend the next hour and a half, 2 hours on the pad, barring bad weather, getting ready. But he was so relaxed that he was the first astronaut to fall asleep on the launch pad. And that was just kind of the way he came to be known, as being so cool and calm and collected, which of course he proved beyond a doubt during the flight itself.
Oklahoma lad had that drawl that was kind of
God.
Everybody loved to hear him talk.
We were talking when we met back in '72, I think it was, at the Plaza Hotel, and I had a chance to talk to him and ask him about Gemini 5 and MA-9 and all the rest of that stuff. And we got onto the subject of the food that he tested on MA-9, the toothpaste tubes, and one of those toothpaste tubes contained pureed beef. And I asked him, I said, "Well, what did that pureed beef taste like?" And he said to me in that voice, he says, "You remember Camel Ration?" I said, "Yeah, the dog food." I said, "You poured it into the bowl and the smell went around the block before it hit the
You're
bowl."
right.
He said, "Well, that's what it tasted like and that's what it smelled like." And that was just his attitude.
You sound like him. Yeah. Quite a character. Like we can't get into his whole life completely there, but boy, he really had an after astronaut career too.
And again, here we are in the capsule.
There's sleep.
You got the off to the side on Gordo's left is circuit breaker panel. You can see some of the push-pull rods for the manual and automatic systems of the spacecraft leading to the fuel systems. And of course, as we're talking during this flight, several of the systems, I think around orbit 18 or so, started to fail one by one. And it was found out later on that there was a water leak in the system of the capsule that was shorting all these things out. And the first thing that went was, again, ASCS, Automatic Stabilization and Control System. And then after that, the attitude indicators were not moving, and the auto system, the fly-by-wire, was not operational. So when it came down to it, they realized that with all these systems failing, that he was going to have to manually put the capsule into retro attitude. He was going to have to manually fire the retros, and he was going to have to manually control that capsule during reentry. So as he told me, he said, I had everything I needed there. I had the eyes out the window for attitude control. I had the push-pull rods for the fuel supply, and I had the hand controller. I had the backup clock on the wrist for time. And those were the things that he relied on to get through that dangerous reentry. And at one point before retrofire, John Glenn was, I think, the Hawaii Capcom. What did he say? He said, I think you're going to get a lot of experience on this flight. And Gordo said, yeah, I'm looking forward to it. So that was the attitude that he carried. And of course, he performed all those maneuvers brilliantly and completely manually. He came back home after over a day and a half in orbit in fairly good shape. Here's the launch again from Launch Pad 14. Beautiful day, a beautiful clear day. And heading uphill, he did all the 30-second reports, the capsule, the fuel supply, the oxygen supply, the pitch angle of the vehicle, and so forth. And all the reports came back just like clockwork, but in that easy, relaxed Oklahoma drawl that was so distinctive of his.
Our Atlas, our Cape Canaveral gallery celebrates the Atlas, over 350 communication satellites.
What a vehicle.
In the ocean there, and with an Agena rocket, about a dozen interplanetary probes to the moon, Venus, and Mars were launched with that rocket.
Again, a picture from up on orbit that Cooper took through that window. And as these pictures are published in Life magazine and National Geographic, we're just beginning to get the faintest idea of the thinness of the Earth's atmosphere. Because you look at the Earth's limb there, you can see that I think originally they called it a haze layer. Well, more than a haze layer, it was a by God atmosphere. And we're beginning to get a true idea as to how thin that atmosphere is and how it protects this planet. In fact, the comparison I most often get from the astronauts is that if the Earth were the size of an apple, the atmosphere would be as thick as that apple peel. And that's all that protects everything that we know of as life on this planet. And we're just beginning to get those, just beginning to feel that understanding from these pictures, starting with the Mercury program.
And we were just getting this was even before we knew we were harming our environment with aerosol sprays and things like that, because the Mercury and Gemini astronauts, I don't hear them talking a lot about the awe of the precious layer there, like the shuttle astronauts do.
Well, understand that was an awareness that grew over time, and that really peaked with Apollo 8 when we saw the whole Earth in one photographic frame. There was understanding here, but not the level of concern that we later came to have as we saw the enormity of this universe and the smallness of the planet. Now, as far as that's concerned, I align myself with Kathy Thornton. Kathy Thornton was asked one time, how did you feel looking at the Earth and seeing how fragile it was? And Kathy said, no, so the Earth isn't fragile. The Earth is strong. The Earth is resilient. It's people that are fragile. And that's exactly the way I take it. This Earth has been around for a long time before us, and it's going to be around a long time after us.
Kathy Thornton, what an amazing lady she is. I can't wait to see. Not only was she an astronaut for over 20 years, she taught physics at the University of Charlottesville for 20 years. And I think her husband's a physicist also.
She's a remarkable lady.
Yeah. Walked the Appalachian Trail.
Yes, she did.
But we digress here with these wonderful stories
from time to time.
that you all are enjoying there. Let's end in our great episode here with
This is
Nick Thomas.
Very rare picture that we had not seen before in the Mercury program, taken from the frogman's perspective
that's an awesome
inside the
photo.
water. And you can see how low that helicopter comes to the water as the next frogman is jumping out. And clearly in this view, just behind your shoulder, you can see the hatch. And Gordo had told the ship that he wanted to remain in the capsule. And since the ship was a little far away, they decided to send a whaler boat out there to grab the capsule by a tow line and tow it to the aircraft carrier, which they did. So he stayed in that capsule again throughout the recovery until it was brought onto the deck of the recovery carrier, which I think was a Randolph. I'd have to go back.
The Kearsarge.
Oh, the Kearsarge.
The
Okay.
Kearsarge,
Right.
and he was at 4.5 miles of it too, by the
Okay.
way. Pretty accurate landing.
Pretty close landing.
Yeah,
Not bad
USS
for,
Kearsarge. I just wrote that for our Facebook.
he
the other
probably
day.
had the record until Gemini 9 and Tom Stafford.
Yeah.
Tom
Yeah.
Stafford had the record for the closest.
That's a hell of a shot, though.
It's a great shot. Great shot. I
a
love
film
it.
camera.
Yeah.
I don't, probably in Mykonos because
You know,
water, but
if I didn't know better, I would have sworn this is something that Ralphie Morris would have done.
yeah, right.
This is the kind of shot he would
It
love.
almost
to have
looks like
taken.
one of those models type of stuff set
Mm-hmm.
up there on there.
And here we are on the recovery carrier, getting out of the capsule, taking that first walk across the deck. Medical people, of course, closely concerned because this is the longest that an American astronaut had stayed up in space. Russians had stayed up longer, but they weren't telling us anything. So we had to find all these things out for ourselves, which we did. Cooper was in good shape, considering, and the flight was put down as a great success. And as the story came out as to the actions Cooper took to bring this flight in successfully, well, that just grew his reputation as being the cool, cold-blooded test pilot that could do something like this.
Mm-hmm.
Cooper, of course, went on to command Gemini 5. His fortunes took a slip because he became more preoccupied with a lot of his outside interests, including racing cars at Daytona Beach. And as Walt Cunningham said, he was on top of it for Gemini 5, but after Gemini 5, he was kind of lackadaisical. He took kind of a casual attitude toward his job, to the point where at the end of the Gemini program, he was selected as the backup commander for Gemini 12, which was a dead-end assignment because there were going to be no further Geminis. So when he finally came back online, he was the backup commander for Apollo 10. Now, under normal rotation, that would have made Gordo the commander of Apollo 14. But Alan Shepard, who had just come back from that surgery on his inner ear, was lobbying for an Apollo flight. And Gordo had spent all this time, unfortunately, alienating a lot of management, whereas Al was busy influencing people and making friends, which he did very well. And when the time came for the decision, Al got the nod and Gordo did not. He left NASA. I met him shortly after that in '72 in Daytona Beach. Mm-hmm. And for all intents and purposes, he seemed to be fine with his life. But others have told me that he was bitterly disappointed by the way he was treated by NASA. But at the same time, he probably should have applied himself more to his job. But that slide in his reputation was just something that he simply couldn't recover from.
Yeah, it's pretty reading universally. Other astronauts around him point out that he was lackadaisical and just didn't have that drive. Mm-hmm. He could have been a moonwalker. No doubt about it.
Well, the thinking was, since he was the youngest of the original 7, the chances were that he would walk on the moon.
Yeah, I mean, it was kind of and to segue out of Gemini as a commander, he probably could have had a second command in Gemini, maybe.
Yeah, possibly so.
In there. But anyway, we've actually standing in line one day out there with you, and we met his daughter. That was there to see Mike Baker. Mm-hmm. Mike Baker's STS-43 mission honored the Mercury astronauts with the capsule shape of there. Our friend Jim Adamson was on that. Jim talks about that. we wanted to get up with her, but like Gordon Cooper, she disappeared too on us somewhere on there. But what an outstanding program. Thank you all for watching. Marty, you got a question as I showing you Space View Park out at, which is what we're all about. These are the handprint monuments in front there. Marty, go ahead as I show them the handprints of Gordon Cooper. What's the question?
Well, before I ask you the question, it came from Amy Collins, but Mark, I'm going to back up on a. Whoops, hit the wrong button.
Sure. Take it over there.
Yeah, just want to back up a little
Show a
bit.
picture.
Where'd you go? Right there. That helicopter is one of the choppers I was flying in Vietnam. And if anybody wants to see that kind of a chopper, if you go to the Marine Corps Museum just south of Washington, D.C., just off of 95, as soon as you walk in the main entrance, that helicopter is sitting right there.
It's the old Sikorsky, isn't it?
Yeah, it's of course the UH-34D Seahorse.
A workhorse for a lot of years.
Yeah.
And when you were a kid back in those days, you said helicopter, that's the image you got in your mind.
And that very helicopter is in the
Marine Corps Museum.
Marine Corps
It's in the-
Museum. Marty Urrah, Marine. He jumped. You rappelled down it, didn't you, sir?
Repelled out of it.
And you rappelled out of it and up it during the first wave of the Vietnam War. There. So I guess you'd know from number 47. Thank you, Marty, for adding that.
Cool.
And we have a question from Amy Collins. Among the seven, Gordon Cooper was closest friend to Gus Grissom. Did he have any stories about Gus?
Well, the only time I can recall we spoke about Gus was Gordo was talking about the fire, and he was still very bitter and very angry about that, about the way that NASA had approached Apollo 1 in such a cavalier way and rushing the schedule and so forth. We didn't talk about Gus per se, but I think that was the closest we got to it, and he was still very angry about losing his friend in that fire, as was Wally. Wally was angry about that till the day he died. But Cooper and Grissom were close. They were both at Edwards together, as I recall. And then I think Gus's closest friend among the seven was Deke Slayton. They were just very simpatico, and there are pictures that Ralph Morse took of them building a fence at Deke's house, and they get the shirts off and they're driving the post hole diggers and putting the posts down and so forth. But he and Deke, John Glenn said that Gus and Deke would fly from coast to coast, and John called it coast to coast in 5 words or less, because the conversation was ready for takeoff. Yep. And then several hours later, ready to land? Yep. That was it.
Okay, I couldn't do that. But everyone's enjoying the show here. Great comments from all of you. Thank you for watching. Amy Collins, my daughter Jessie is watching with my granddaughters McKinley and Macy. Hi, girls. Doug Forrest is watching in Los Angeles. Old Cliff Watson, he woke up Tuesday morning in Pomona, Australia to watch you today. Got Bill Whiting, Connie McDaniel, your groupies out there.
STG, the Space Task Group.
And Tammy. And Mitch Rothman, Mark Thel. Read off the rest of them there for us there.
Well, you have me at a disadvantage. You gotta make me do this.
Well, they like hearing your Gordon Cooper voice.
Oh, shut up. Here's Tom Colbert, Dave Stange, Steve J, RG Jubilee, Tom Usiak, of course. Hello, Tommy. CB, Carlton Bailey. Always a pleasure to see Carlton out at the ranch. Robert Law, Dion Babcock, is that? Okay, and is that Sundog?
Dean Babcock.
Is that Sundog 7 I see there?
Uh-huh.
Okay, there's got to be a story behind that.
Absolutely.
And of course, Tom Celentano, Gary Gerald, Mark Thel, Mitch Rothman, as we mentioned, Tammy, and all the gang. Thank you all very much for tuning in today and joining us. It's always a pleasure being up here with Mark and get to share these stories, which I've been privileged to experience in my life.
No, thank you very much. It's always a privilege. Your friendship that we've made over the years is part of what makes this museum click with so many of you out there. We really appreciate everybody's support. This is part of what we do. Where else are you going to hear these kinds of stories but on Stay Curious? And tomorrow we're going to rack it up with some more wonderful stories from this guy in the middle there, Terry White, and talk about the chin of the orbiter. And then Wednesday, we got Mayor Andrew Connors is going to talk a little bit about how he gets it, that Spaceview Park is a one-of-a-kind place here in Titusville, and what we're doing to celebrate the birth of America's space age is something that no one else is doing. And Nick, you're a happy part of it, and thank you so much. You have a great week out there at Kennedy Space Center as we roll from May into the busy tourist time of June.
We have Mark Lee out with us this week.
Oh, great. Yep, Mark Lee. Yes, and went out and saw Mark Lee.
Spacewalker.
Absolutely.
And Hubble guy.
Yeah.
Who's got some great stories about the Hubble, so be sure to come out and hear those stories.
And Daniel Tanney.
Dan Tanney coming, right.
The first guest they had out there that lived on the International Space Station. And now we have so many others out there. So thank you all for watching. Marty, thank you for a great job on Streamlabs there. And until tomorrow with Terry White, I'm Mark Marquette saying we can't wait to see you in our museum to bridge the space between us.